Hello and welcome. I am the Restless Kaiser and we are modelling for advantage. So this is the second painting video in the WARCRY series, looking at the second set of the scenery, looking at the scatter pieces rather than the individual walls. A lot of the stuff we used in the first video we're going to reuse in this video. So let's get cracking. The first and easiest piece to talk about is these little standing walls. We painted something very similar when we did the scenery, so as before we're going to undercoat the whole thing grey. We're going to dry brush it with celestra grey to give it that highlight, and then we're going to wash the whole thing in Athonian camo shade. We're then going to paint the brickwork in corn red carefully, and we're going to highlight that with Troll Slayer orange, just like we did in the previous video. You get these few itty bitty little pieces of scatter scenery. Again, we're using the same process for doing our stonework with the Athonian camo shade, and we're going to just pick out a handful of the details on here and we're going to paint them. We're going to paint them with some metallics and some yellows and some reds, and we're going to use Rakarth flesh for the skulls. The point about little bits of scenery like this is to add visual interest to the board. They don't perform any function in most games that you're ever going to use the scenery for, so put a little bit of effort in, paint the vases different colours, and then wash the whole thing with Agrax shade. As you can see in the still here, some of these recesses are quite deep, so watch out for big pools of Agrax shade. You're going to need to get back in there with a dry, broad brush and soak some of that up. The ladders, which we've modelled separately so that we can use them with different layouts on the battlefield, we're going to paint in the same way as we did the timber work. This is cut timber, just like we did with the buildings, so I painted the whole lot dryad bark, let it dry, and then dry brushed it with the Mournfang brown. We're going to let the detail moulded in on the model provide those highlights. There's not a lot in the side of the model or at the edges, so when you dry brush them, be extra careful to make sure that you catch those edges to give it some highlight on those otherwise quite bland surfaces. So these platforms, gantries, running boards, whatever you want to call them, these are going to do a little bit differently because this contains a mixture of the timber work that we've had before, the cut timber, and the kind of branches and twigs, the logs, and so there's two different phases to this. I want the two to look different, but not radically different. So we base coat the two different timber types with the same base coat. We use the Rhinox hide again. It's difficult to handle this piece without getting paint on your fingers, so as you can see in the still here, I painted one end and then let it dry and then painted the other end. I dry brushed the cut timbers once again with the Mournfang brown, just like we have elsewhere, but then we go on to the next stage. For all of the uncut timbers and the sharpened stakes, we leave them the Rhinox hide that we've already got, but we take out the Zandri dust. We give a light dry brush to all of the bark, which is going to bring out the detailing in the bark, but it's not going to make it too bright. I still want the bark pretty dark. This isn't freshly cut timber, but the tips are, the sharpened areas are. So I've painted those with just clean Zandri dust. You could add some highlight layers to these edges, and there might be some value in this, but this project has been going on forever. So I just paint the Zandri dust, I rotate the model and paint all 4 or 5 surfaces to make sure I've got a good finish, and I use 2 solid coats on this. It's also worth noting that there's rope work holding all of these logs and timbers together on these. You may want to paint those separately later, but the dry brush of Zandri dust has brought them out in sufficient detail, so you might be happy just with that. I certainly was. So now we've got those base colours down on our timber, we need to look at some of the detailed areas. One of the most common details on these are skulls and skeletons. I'm going to paint these with Rakarth flesh, and we're going to give it 2 coats. I don't find Rakarth flesh covers particularly well over darker areas, so you might want to even go back and give this one a 3rd coat, with paying particular attention to across the face. You need to be painting these details quite carefully so as not to get any of this paint spilling over onto the already completed timber areas. Then moving on to the metallic parts, there's 2 of these really. One is a kind of broken chaos star that appears throughout the barricades, and the other is the chains that are attached to one of the barricades holding up the skeletons. I used lead belcher, I applied 2 thin coats to this, and again mindful and careful so as not to paint any of the other areas. Some of these barricades contain the stonework that we've done before in the buildings and some of these other pieces of scattered terrain. So again, it's the same process. We use mechanicus standard grey as our base coat, we apply a highlight of celestra grey, and then we wash it with the Athonian camo shade. The last step with the timberwork, the barricades, is the Agrax earth shade. Agrax earth shade, my friends, I've said many times before, is bottled talent, and it's going to do a cracking job here. You want to put Agrax on the skeletons, you want to put Agrax on the skulls, you want to put Agrax on the areas of the sharpened stakes. It's particularly going to provide some definition between the transition from the bark to the cut areas. And if you've elected not to paint the rope work separately, I'd encourage you to apply Agrax in the area of the rope work because it's going to add additional definition. I didn't put Agrax across the bark because I didn't want to dull it down at all. The last thing to talk about is the big giant head, which is a very prominent part of the scenery, much like the bell tower. I painted the wooden pulpit separately from the head itself, which is important as it's used in different scenery layouts for the different WARCRY battle maps. The head as our final piece of scatter scenery was primed black, unlike all of the other pieces which are primed grey. So to paint the stonework around the base of it, I used mechanicus standard grey, I used a dry brush of celestra grey, and then a wash of Athonian camo shade, exactly like all of the other stonework. But the head itself, I wanted the black because I wanted that darker undercolour, because I didn't want to paint this in a great deal of detail, but I still wanted it to be recognisable. There's quite a lot of detail on this model, so you can let the dry brush do the work for you. So with the black undercoat, the black priming, I just took the celestra grey and the mechanicus standard grey and the ulthern grey and worked my way up with an increasingly lighter dry brush. So the mechanicus standard dry brush went everywhere, was fairly heavy, then the celestra grey everywhere but a little bit lighter, and finally ulthern grey with a very light dry brush only in certain areas near the top part of the model. These tiny little pieces, well, what are they? They're the same, aren't they? The only difference between this and the other stonework is that I painted the eagle head with retributor armour and gave it an Agrax earth shade. It was a big job, this. It took me about 2 days all in. I did a little bit of experimenting here and there, and there's still some things that I'd like to go back to. But overall, I'm fairly happy with the result. I'll probably go back and have a look at the top stones from those buildings again. But for the meantime, this model is ready for the table. Thank you for watching.